Hi, everybody. Good morning. I know some of you are still getting your lunch, and that is great. Take your time. I'm just going to get started so that we can get moving into our program. I want to welcome you to the second film in the new bioethics film series. And the film we're watching today, as you probably know, is Rare. And thank you for coming. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Holly Tabor, and I'm a bioethicist here at Children's. And I wanted to just briefly introduce the film series, and then make sure I thank all the folks who helped make this happen. And lastly, mention a few logistics prior to showing the film. So the film series was the idea, actually, of Kate Landry, who's a staff member of the Treuman Katz Center for Pediatric Bioethics. And its intent is to periodically show films here within the children's community to provoke discussion among all of us regarding important and timely ethical issues related to the health and well-being of children. We plan to continue having these film screenings and discussions about twice a year, so please look out for the next installment of the film series in the next few months. We also want to thank the filmmakers behind today's film, Maren Granger Monson and Nicole Noonan, who graciously allowed us to screen the film today. This is a brilliant, award-winning documentary that invites viewers into the world of someone living with a rare genetic disease. And it also introduces the doctors who are studying rare genetic diseases and offers an intimate window into the realm of clinical trials. The film is an honest portrayal of what it means to have a rare disease, the role of patient advocates, and the successes and disappointments of clinical research. I also want to thank our colleagues who generously supported and co-sponsored this event today, including the Center for Clinical and Translational Research at Seattle Children's, the Center for Genomics and Healthcare Equality at the University of Washington, and the Institute of Translational Health Sciences. I'm also very grateful for the time and contribution of our panelists who will be leading the discussion and question and answer period after the screening, and I'm going to hold off introducing them until we transition from the film to the discussion. So lastly, I want to mention a few other logistical issues. For those of you who are physicians, you can claim CME credit category 2 for attending today if you so desire. And the format for the discussion after the film, which is just under an hour long, will be that we'll have a discussion, question, and answer session with the panelists. We'll have 2 roving microphones. So if you have a question, please raise your hand indicating so, and we'll get you a microphone so everyone can hear it. And also, we really want to hear from you about what you thought of this film series session. So please, we have evaluation forms. We may distribute them during the discussion panel. And if you could hand them in as you walk out, that would be a huge help to us. So now, without further ado, let's sit back and watch Rare. Let's try. Thanks. I've seen that film several times now, and I never fail to be moved by it. So I'd like to invite our panelists to come up to the table sitting in the order of that you're on here, and I'm just going to introduce you. I'm first going to introduce Dr. Bonnie Ramsey. As many of you may know her, she's the director of the Center for Clinical and Translational Research here at Seattle Children's Research Institute. She's also co-PI of the Institute for Translational Health Sciences. She's professor and vice chair for research in the Department of Pediatrics, and her career has focused on clinical care and research in cystic fibrosis. She's internationally recognized for her work in developing new therapies for patients with CF, and she directs the CF Therapeutics Development Network that directs clinical trials throughout the United States. Next, I want to interview DeDe Van Quill. Ms. Van Quill has been the volunteer director for Nager Miller Syndrome for the past 11 years. She has a BA in Business Administration and Marketing and a minor in Sociology from Washington State University. And she's the mother of 3 teenagers, aged 17, 14, and 14. And her son, Jackson, who is 14, has Miller Syndrome. We're also delighted to have on the panel today Dr. Dan Doherty. Dan is Associate Professor of Pediatrics here at Seattle Children's University of Washington, and his research is focused on the study of several rare hindbrain malformation disorders, most prominently GBarre Syndrome. He's also chair of the Scientific Advisory Board for the GBarre Syndrome and Related Disorders Foundation. And last but not least, we're very happy to have with us here today Taryn and Dean Suhr. Dean and Taryn co-founded the MLD Foundation after a long diagnostic odyssey where 2 of their 3 daughters were diagnosed with the rare disease metachromatic leukodystrophy. Their younger daughter, Darcy, passed away at age 10 after an experimental bone marrow transplant to slow the progression of the disease in 1995. And their oldest daughter, Lindy, is alive and doing better than predicted at age 33. Dean is the president of the MLD Foundation and is active on behalf of the rare disease community with special interest in global health, registries, newborn screening, diagnostics, consent, privacy, and empowering other advocacy organizations. And he recently joined the Genetic Alliance staff part-time as a registry manager. And Taryn is the executive director of the MLD Foundation. She is a former pediatric nurse with experience in newborn and neonatal intensive care nurseries. And the MLD Foundation connects over 300 MLD families from around the world, holds regular family conferences in the U.S. and internationally, and is involved in developing newborn screening for MLD, as well as working with researchers and industry in clinical trial and design recruitment. So we're very lucky to have all these folks here today with us to talk about many of the issues in the film. And we have about a little under half an hour for discussion and question answer. So I think we're going to start asking the panelists a couple questions, but then we're going to take questions from the audience. So if you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand and we'll have folks bring you a microphone so we can hear it. So I just wanted to start by asking each of you, so, at one point in the film, Dr. Gall from NIH says that we wouldn't be doing research on Hermansky-Pudlak Syndrome if it wasn't for Donna Appel. And Donna also talks about the role that hope plays in her work and the work of the families involved in the foundation or in the trial. So I guess I wondered if we could just start with Dr. Ramsey and then continue on. If you could say a few brief words about how much patient advocates play a role and what happens for rare diseases where maybe there aren't people like Donna to advocate for those research for those conditions. So Dr. Ramsey, why don't you go first?
So my experience is in cystic fibrosis, and the foundation started back in the, I think, 1950s with several Donnas. I've met many people like that in my life. It is a very successful example of patient advocacy, and I totally agree with Dr. Gall. You cannot have clinical trials if you don't have patients, and patient advocacy groups are often one of the best sources for finding and informing and educating families. So I think it's incredibly important.
DeDe, you have any thoughts on that from your experiences?
My biggest thought is that, I'm still trying to figure out what I do with all my time compared to that woman. I really want to meet her and figure out how to copy her. But I think we have at FNMS have been at one point instrumental in recruiting patients just for the gene study, just to find the genes for both syndromes. But it takes a lot more than that, obviously.
Yeah. So there's a lot of work that goes into every stage. Yeah.
Exactly.
Dan, you
I think it's important to recognize the role for family organizations, both at the level of recruiting, but also fundraising, raising awareness, as they were doing in the clinic in the Bronx, and really almost every level of both research, treatment, and family support. So I think, depending on the organization, they can have a role in all of those things, and even direct funding for some organizations that have reached that size and that level of financial commitment.
And as a parent and a co-founder of a foundation that's small, and still having children with the disease, it's extremely difficult to do all that. And especially when you see the need amongst the families for it. We were fortunate in that a drug company actually approached us for a clinical trial. But it's very frustrating, and you do think about the other rare diseases that are small in numbers, the ultra-rare diseases that don't have and can't have the kinds of numbers for clinical trials, and it's frustrating as a patient advocacy group.
So I would say, first, thank you for having us here. It's wonderful. I think that's true, but you know what? We're just regular people like you're regular people too. And hope is something certainly we instill and mitigate. Sometimes we raise it up, sometimes we bring it down a little bit, expectations with the families. But we do the same thing when we're with groups like this, or we're in with a pharma company or on Capitol Hill or whatever, is we each do what we can. And it just happens that part of our role, you all have access, to labs and test tubes and whatever you have access to. We have access to families. And so we all put those pieces together and join together. So it's a group effort.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think several people that raised a point, and was raised in the film, about hope and the role of hope for people like yourselves who are helping organize advocacy groups to work towards research and treatment and also provide support, but also hope that the researchers give and wanting to sort of balance and not raise hopes in a inappropriate way. And I guess I wondered if any of you had any comments from your own experiences about the role of hope and about the challenges that Dr. Gall talked about, sort of wanting to be realistic and how to communicate that to families in an optimistic way. So I was just curious if any of you have any comments about that.
Well, I don't know that optimistic is the word I would use.
Yeah.
It's probably more a realistic way,
Realistic.
Mm-hmm.
but do that in a way, in words that the families can understand at the time you're speaking to them. Because so often, we have family conferences every year as well, much like what you saw in the film, and the families all come to the conference because they want to learn about research, and their expectations are, or their desires, so what's the progress and so on. And that's what gets them to the conference. But really what they take home is the relationships and the values and the insights that they get from each other. And I don't want to derail your agenda a little bit, but Dr. Gall, who I've had the pleasure of drinking beer with and talking at length with, he's a wonderful guy. But he said something in there about, we all want the doctors to be, and the researchers to be, not cry, because you're kind of the rock. You're supposed to be, black, white, X, Y, Z, all that kind of thing. And, I think there's a little bit of truth in that, because we're putting trust in those who we perceive to be smarter people. But the reality is these communities are so small. The diseases are so small. I mean, what you saw with Donna and Bill, and I can call them Donna and Bill because that's how we talk in this community, you build a relationship. You're not just number 5,832. You build a relationship. And so it's normal that we start to relate as people, and it's healthy, and I think it's good. We all have to retreat a little bit, do our own thing. I mean, we've told drug companies no. We've said we're not going to do that, or we don't think you should do that, or whatever. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, we've got strong relationships, and I think part of the message that I want to convey is that this is a team. And we'll speak a little different when we're talking to the patients. I hate that word, but when we're talking to the families, but realistically, we're all in this together.
Bonnie, did you have something you wanted to say?
No, that's okay.
Oh, okay.
Just real briefly, I think the majority of foundations and groups that are support groups that have been started for rare diseases were completely founded on hope. It was the hope of finding others, the hope of being able to do something once you find others, the hope that something better will come along for your group and for those affected and the families that you serve. So I think that the vast majority run on hope.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I think we want to open it up and see if anyone in the audience has questions. I have more questions I could ask, but is there anyone in the audience who has a question they'd like to raise their hand? Don't be shy. Well, I have another question. I was sort of thinking about the diagnostic journey we heard and what it's like to live with rare diseases about which we may know some things, but for which we may not have effective treatments. And the film followed Heather and Ashley a little bit through that journey, and the sense that there's sort of a sense of urgency and time running out, and how it affects their lives, and they balance that with wanting to be advocates and research participants. And so I wondered if any of you had any comments about how you've seen that play out in your own groups and work and communities, and sort of what it's like to be a family experiencing the disease at the same time that you're trying to work for research and progress in the disease. So either as a researcher or as a family member.
Our disease has three forms. There's a late infantile form, a juvenile form, and an adult form. And the late infantile form is very rapid. you think you have a normal child in the beginning, and then by age 12 months, they stop making their milestones, and you find out that you're told that they're going to die before the age of 5. So in our case, the late infantile.
If you're diagnosed.
The diagnostic odyssey is another story, because most of these kids are told, oh, you'll just give them time. They're a late bloomer. They'll walk, whatever. And when they don't, they finally get the MRI, which finally leads to, well, there's something wrong in your brain, and then the tests start. Drawing blank. The original question was?
Well, it's just living with the disease and balancing that with trying to advocate for research.
Yeah, and so in our
research.
case, our children had the juvenile form, so we had more time. But when we met the kids with the late infantile form, it just, time is what, as long as it takes to get a treatment or a cure or a drug or something, a day in these kids' lives is like a year or more. And so it is a race against time for our kiddos and other rare diseases that we know as well.
Yeah, we didn't come into this thinking we'd get a cure for our other daughter. From 6 years of diagnostic odyssey, 2 kids diagnosed, 6 months later, 1 had passed away. And then a whole different journey started, I mean, you can imagine. But we didn't start the foundation thinking there was anything we could do for our older daughter, because they told us she had 4 or 5 years to go, and at that point we were told there was no magic pill, sugar or otherwise. So we got in the business, so to speak, of helping families and helping them on the journey, and then only discovered along the way the importance and the value that we could bring by connecting those families back into research and dealing, as Taryn mentioned, with pharma companies along the way and so on as well. So we came in maybe a little bit different than some others do, but sooner or later we all kind of end up doing or trying to do a lot of those same things in parallel.
Bonnie, I know that CF has sort of changed over the years.
Right. So I've been working, I don't have a family member with CF, but I've certainly worked with the families for over 30 years now. And, it has changed drastically, although it still is a fatal disease. I think that it's hard to, if you're constantly thinking about the timeline, it's hard to keep up hope. I do think it's very important to have shorter term goals, because when I think in CF, the first changes that we made, which was back in the 80s and 90s, was better therapies for just day-to-day living, for not treating the underlying disease. And that in of itself completely changed it from an inpatient to an outpatient disease. I mean, that is a huge change. I can remember a family saying to me, "You've given us back our lives because we're at home." So I think if you have shorter term goals, that's really, really important. One of the things, even though there's been dramatic changes in CF, again, those dramatic changes are for a subpopulation, so you still have the majority that are waiting, and now you have a difficult situation where a small group have had this miracle and the rest of them haven't, so you've got to deal with that. And the second thing is that you talk about the support and bringing everybody together. Well, in CF, they colonize, contaminate themselves, so they can't be together. So all of a sudden you bring all these support groups and they use each other's support, and now they cannot be in the same room ever. And so that is a huge emotional problem. So it's all become online. That's the only communication they can have.
That was one of my questions in the film. Donna and her team are working so hard to recruit people throughout the world, and the film followed them over 3 years and was finished a couple of years ago. From your work, any of you, how do you think the internet has changed or could change the way we do research and support for families with rare diseases? So, DeDe, you're nodding your head.
Well, it has been dramatic for us. We don't have the resources for interpreters, but we have members in probably 40 countries now, and I would say that one of my biggest hopes is to figure out a way to get access to the biggest population centers, which we don't, and we know that because both Nager and Miller cross all ethnic boundaries, that China and India have to have, maybe they don't survive, but have to have families that have those syndromes. So the internet is our key, and we had foreign families before the internet, but the transmission of information, took postal service time, and it's been dramatic for us.
Anyone else want to comment on that?
I can comment a little bit. The disorder I study most is called GBarre Syndrome, and that too affects all ethnicities. It was first recognized in the 1960s, but really the diagnostic test, the MRI, didn't come around till 1997. And the first genes identified that cause GBarre didn't come around till 2004. So it's a less mature disorder than cystic fibrosis. We still don't have essentially any specific therapies for the disorder, but since 2004, we now know of 23 different genes that cause the same condition, GBarre syndrome. And that, just the ability to get the diagnosis for families from all over the world, so they send MRIs to me and other investigators that study GBarre, and they finally identify somebody who actually knows what they have, and that actually changes their medical care. So people with GBarre syndrome can have complications in their retina, in their kidney, in their liver that need to be followed and could be treated early and allow for better outcomes. And then now the focus, as we transition from identifying the genetic causes, is to developing treatments, and that's going to be a long process. Bonnie said, 1950s was when things started, so we have decades to go, but at least we have a foothold.
You have a little better technology today.
Yeah. Hopefully the timeline will be shorter. And we do understand some of the biology, and there are some exciting developments, but it's still going to be a long haul.
And I hope, I agree, the internet has connected and opened up people groups to a lot of this rare disease, and my hope is that it will help the rare disease community as a whole to start doing some of the lobbying as a group so that we can get better treatments for all the diseases.
And it helps research as well. I mean, and you touched on this a little bit, Ben. It's not just how are we connecting families, but if we identify a researcher, asks us a question, wants to know something, we can say, well, we know a family over in this country or that country or this next city or your city. And it's not just the communication that the internet brings, but as you point out, the technology and the ability to database. I'm doing registry work, so obviously it's close to me, but to kind of have these profiles of patients and families where we can expedite this discovery process because we already have those relationships and know those families.
Yeah.
And we've enrolled from more than 20 countries around the world, which would never have been possible without the internet.
Yeah.
The question up there?
Yeah. Thanks so far for your comments, and I just want to build on some of the things that you guys have said. I imagine one of the major barriers for any of us who do research, but especially those of you who have children with or do research on patients who have disorders that are very rare, is to gain the interest of funders to help you keep studying those and find cures, et cetera, especially federal funders. And sort of implicit in Dr. Dahl's statement in the movie, and evident by the title of the movie, is that he sort of had to make the case that to pursue HPS, a clinical trial, he had to make the case that there was, a potential that what they found would have benefit to other more common disorders.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm just interested from all of you how you navigate that, how you strategize. I'm sure there's an explicit intentional strategy, either similar to what Dr. Dahl did or otherwise. And because the stories behind the people with these disorders is very provocative, yet given competing demands and other more common things, I think it's really difficult.
So my experience in that, and thank you for bringing that up, and you hit on a couple of topics. One is funding, so let me just start with that. One of the things that the advocacy groups can do is provide that seed funding. Not all of them. We, for example, our group, we don't spend a lot of energy on fundraising, but we connect dollars. We connect other people's money. It just doesn't come through us, which is fine. But we can help with those dollars for the pre-federal grants or the pre-big, Robert Wood Johnson, or whoever's funding whatever it is you're working on, those 6, 7-figure type grants, 5-figure grants. And so that's another partnership or another way we can kind of get started together. I always like to say that we want to bet on all the ponies. We want them all to win. We want them all to come around. I don't care what order they come in. We just want them to all finish, and then we'll sort out all the rest of that. The second thing was, you mentioned just kind of the rareness of the diseases and the number of potential patients. The mindset is shifting, not only in the government, but I think in a lot of places of research, that we're beginning to recognize that all of us have bad genes. Every one of you has got some bad genes. We don't know what they are, and they probably, for the most part, aren't going to bother you through your life. But what you could discover in a family like mine or any of these other 7,000 plus rare diseases are extreme cases of a problem, and Dr. Gall referred to this, where by focusing in on the pulmonary fibrosis aspect of HPS, we may learn something that helps a much, much broader population, and we're starting to figure that out. We are the outliers, the rare diseases, and that's where you can actually see and demonstrate things. As we get smarter and smarter, and at the same time probably more equally as confused about the human genome, our ability to map that, as I hope most of you know, mapping your genomes is a lot of data, but it's not necessarily information. And that's a start, but in essence, I think it's going to say, you know what, somebody mentioned that there's however many forms of disease there are. All of a sudden, there's 12 or 24 or 50 forms of that, because there's kind of these subclasses, and the cancers will split off and all those kinds of things as well. And so we are all becoming more and more unique as we learn more and more about how all that works.
I think in terms of how do you get the money, I will say I think the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation has been an unbelievable leader.
Yes.
And has set the groundwork. I mean, Bob Bell, the CEO, terms it venture philanthropy.
Mm-hmm.
But through their progress, they have shown industry that this is very profitable, for better or worse. And biotech is now screaming into rare diseases. Now I acknowledge CF is big compared to a lot of ultra rare diseases, but it's a very different world out there. And I think that you have to be aggressive and you have to sell yourself, and that's exactly, CF started out as, bake sales and shopping malls just like everybody else, and they decided they were going to go big, and they did.
So Bonnie, you say big, just so we're clear with the audience here. You're not really that big, right? It's
No.
tens of thousands of patients.
Yeah, it's
which
like
is not
50, 60,000 worldwide.
Yeah,
Not that big.
so big is relative, because
Yeah.
we're down in the hundreds of patients. But if you think about, do you want to invest tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars and a decade developing a drug for even 50,000 patients? Does that make sense?
Mhm.
And it does.
We might have time for another question over here. Julia, can you up there? Thanks.
I kind of want to build on the same sort of topic. And, when you build a building in Seattle, you have to put 1% of the cost of building that building towards art. I'm wondering if the advocacy groups have ever thought about banding together and thinking about, for pharmaceutical companies, you have to take a percentage of your profits and put them towards rare disease research.
1%. What we could do with 1%. No, we've not thought of that specifically, but in fairness to pharma, and I think Dr. Gall referred to this, or Donna referred to this, we believe in the process. We believe in the scientific process and all those things. They are putting their money into this segment. The big companies are coming around the corner and saying, guess what? The rare disease space is a space where there's money to be made, there's diseases to better understand, and so on. What we are doing, maybe in parallel with that, we being the rare disease community, is we're getting better at working together. So 7,000 rare diseases, when you break that down, each one of those diseases is rare, some less rare than others, but still rare. But when you add all of that up, that's 1 in 10 Americans, and roughly that same number as best we know internationally. And so two weeks ago was Rare Disease Week in Washington, D.C., February 29th, which didn't happen this year. But
February 28th on the days.
so it's the 28th. But so we all gather on cold days in D.C. and remind Congress, and this occurs at all different levels, but 1 in 10 is a lot of voters. And when you add in, the patient and 2 parents and a school teacher and somebody at church and the grandparents, I mean, all of a sudden this is a big voting block from a policy perspective, but also an influencing block to figure out, how can we get things done. So we are getting smarter at that. We've got a long ways to go there too.
And 50% of those rare diseases affect children.
I think the other thing, just from my experience too, is that it's also institutional in terms of encouraging researchers and institutions to encourage people like Dan and Bonnie and other people to study rare diseases, when sometimes that work can be long and
Yeah.
sometimes that funding is sometimes harder, but that's part of what helps progress be
Right.
made as well too. So that's a little different than the profit percentage, but it's another way of encouraging it. So.
It is a bit of a way, potentially. I mean, you've got to find the right support groups and finances and disease, but a place to differentiate if you're kind of doing your career thing as to where you can publish or where you can be first or where you can start driving and influencing, because there's only 4 or 5 other people in the world that are working in this space. And so depending upon how you're built and how you're wired for your research, that's something to consider.
Well, at the
as
same
well.
time collaborating though with others.
Oh, of
so
course,
Yeah.
of
You
course.
don't silo everything.
But you don't have to be number 20,000 in the
Right.
field.
Well, we do have some more time. Does anyone have any other questions? I did also want to, one more question, Ben. Yeah.
Well, I guess this is really a question for everybody on the panel. One of the things that struck me in the film was the fact that the way the story turned out, that methadone actually didn't work. And so much what we see on TV are these cures that suddenly are these major breakthroughs and everyone's fighting for them and it works. And so I'm not quite sure what my question is, but I guess I really want you to reflect on that. And how do we sort of incorporate that reality along with the hopes, desires, expectations that things will work?
You want to try that?
Well, the vast majority of studies don't work.
Yes.
So I was glad to see that this was a little realistic. It's hard, again, having worked with families for 30 years. It's really fun to get up there when it's a success. But you just have to say, I think whether it works or not, you always learn something from a study, and you have to put that in perspective, and I think that helps. But I was glad they were very realistic. So.
And from saying that there is no cure, no treatment, every disease is treatable. There is something you can do, whether it's just increasing quality of life or whatever. And when we have patients that are parents that there's a clinical trial, we're very careful to explain to them that it's an experiment. They're seeing if this works in humans. It's not a cure, it's not a treatment, it's a step, hopefully forward, but it may not, probably won't benefit your child.
Yeah, we had one of our therapies that failed, and it was a big learning process.
And it was hard on the parents in the trial.
But as you said, we learn from our failures. Perhaps we learn more from our failures if we're honest and transparent about that. So it's kind of the nature of the beast.
But it's hard to
Of course it's hard, yeah.
give that hope still, even though something failed.
DeDe, did you have something you wanted to?
Yeah, no, I was just going to say it's still progress. It's, and I thought one of the most interesting things about the film was that, it said that the pirfenidone is now used in Japan and Europe.
Yeah.
And so I thought, well, do they have different studies?
Right.
Yeah, I think that is not uncommon for many clinical trials that they get approved in some countries and not in others for a variety of reasons. Well, I think with that, I want to do a couple of things. First of all, I want to thank our panelists very much for taking their time and coming a long distance in some cases, so thank you very much. I want to remind you that we really want your feedback, and we have, Ellen's holding up a survey that we have. If you could briefly fill that out and give us some feedback, that would be really helpful for the next film series. I also just want to mention that coincidentally, Maren Granger-Monson and Nicole Noonan have a film that's airing tonight on PBS, premiering on PBS tonight, called The Revolutionary Optimists. And looking at sort of global health and issues in Calcutta slums. And if you're interested, that's also on this evening. And I just want to thank you very much for coming to this discussion. It was very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.